welcome to another one of our monthly workshops. And in the past, we've sort of had topics that talked about the legal and religious rights of Muslim foster youth, taking a trauma-informed approach to Muslim and Afghan foster youth, as well as talking about religious holidays of Eid and mosque etiquette. And we have all those recordings available on our YouTube page as well. And in the coming months, we're planning to talk about how to navigate the upcoming holiday season with Muslim foster youth as well. So those are the types of things that we talk about. And most of our topics come from what you as agency staff tell us, or what we hear from families in terms of what are the major issues that are going on, what are some things that you'd like us to cover and talk about, things like that. And so today's session also came from one of those sort of conversations, or many conversations that we've actually had recently about that kind of issue. And so as we go through, I'll sort of answer some of those things, and then also at the end we'll talk about like this current scenario that's going on and how to maybe approach that and address that, as well as if any of you have certain scenarios as well. So, I'm not going to go into too much detail. I hope you all know who we are as Muslim Foster Care Association, but just to mention that we are a nonprofit organization that was started by two Muslim foster parents in Michigan. And the main purpose is that we have all of these services to support, Muslim foster youth, as well as those who care for them, you at the agency staff. That's really what we're trying to do, is to support your role as much as possible as well. So my name is Rishtia Cocker, and I'm currently working as a program coordinator at MFCA. I've been here almost 6 months now in this role. And, in a previous workshop, I sort of shared about my background as an Afghan American, with my father being from the farmlands of Afghanistan. I was raised Muslim, and my mother being from the farmlands in the US. She was raised as a Mennonite. And, that's really helped me. We've talked about previously about cultural humility and sort of thinking about how different cultures interact and how we all live together in this world. And then another little thing about myself is that that's sort of related to this presentation. I recently completed my graduate studies in public health, and on my PhD dissertation was actually around the topic of preventing gendered violence through the understanding of cultural and religious contexts. And so hopefully at the end of this presentation, I'll actually be able to share some of those research findings and quotes from some of my participants as it relates to the topic that we're talking about today. So as I mentioned, we're gonna go through sort of the Islamic perspectives on intergender interactions. Then we'll explain the cultural perspectives on gender roles and how those things sort of differ, and maybe you can sort of tell after this presentation some things that you're seeing. Is that the Islamic perspective? Is that the cultural perspective? Or is it something else? And then, as I mentioned at the end, we'll go through some practical takeaways and sort of have time for your questions and your scenarios as well. So I always like to start off with just discussing about cultural humility, because the essence of cultural humility is that we need the reminder over and over again. And so for myself as well, I need that reminder as we go through today. I hope all of you can also help me embody this as well. And so, generally, what is cultural humility? The aspect of respecting others' values and beliefs. That sounds very basic. We all do that. But at the same time, it has to be in a way that's recognizing that no culture is superior to another. And that's sort of where it comes in for us to really be aware of our power imbalances and our biases. We all have biases, and really trying to be aware of those and reflect on them and question them as we hear about other cultures or interact with other people from other cultures. And sometimes that can be really overwhelming. Do I need to know everything about another culture? But really, the purpose of cultural humility is not to memorize or know everything there is to know about other groups. I know after many, many years of marriage, my parents are still learning new things about each other and their cultures and their families. But rather, it's sort of this lifelong process of reflecting on how all of our biases sort of impact the way that we treat and understand other people. I'm going to sort of focus on that a lot. As how do our biases reflect impact the way that we treat and understand other people. And so then, that's really, it's about being open about what we haven't learned yet. And that once we are able to do that, then we can acknowledge that, no one can get it right all the time, but we need to have that continuous sort of curiosity of, respectful curiosity, rather than making assumptions and generalizations about other people. Okay, so thank you for letting me, sort of review that and go through that. And, I hope anytime that you notice me not embodying this, you'll also, question me on that. And then we can all sort of help each other through embodying cultural humility. So the first section we're going to talk about is the Islamic perspectives on intergender interactions. And many of you, mentioned some points that you might see me mention throughout this presentation in that first slide when I asked you about the assumptions, and hopefully you'll be able to see, okay, what were the things that that you mentioned that are within this, or maybe they're within the cultural one. So let's see how that starts off. So the first thing to understand about Muslims is that we view Islam as a complete way of life. And what that means, you might have heard this many times, but what that means is that we basically believe that it permeates into our lives every day. So it's not something that we do on one day of the week or in one area, but rather generally we understand that it's from the time we wake up until the time we sleep, including our sleep. So that's why our gender interactions or interactions with anyone comes under what we believe as Islamic perspective as well. And then the other thing we really want to be clear about is that within Islam, it's very clear that there's mutual respect for all and love for the sake of God. And there's absolutely no place within true Islam for any possible justification within the religion that for discrimination between any genders or races. And that's the same, Islam views all humans as equally valuable, very similar to many other religions. And unfortunately, despite this being very clearly laid out within many, many places in Islam, we still see it happening. And that's sort of, what we try to emphasize and share with Muslims also about how to not be doing that as well. And, something that you might often hear Muslims using is the term brother and sister. I know when I was in college, all my classmates or anyone they're all brothers and sisters, or that's how we refer to them. And that comes from a point of respect, a point of sort of setting your boundaries or how we're respecting people, but also that concept of all being one family for the sake of God and things like that. But if you hear those terms, it doesn't really mean that those people are siblings or that's how they're referring to them, but it's sort of like a respectful term like Mr. or Miss or things like that to sort of set those boundaries. And then the next thing we have to sort of understand is what are the purpose for the guidelines? Why does Islam even have guidelines or limits on these intergender interactions? And really an important point to note here is that Islam doesn't forbid males and females from having those natural human interactions that we all need in order for our society to progress and to work. But rather the purpose of the guidelines is really to strike that balance, between the need for it and also preventing any unwanted, inappropriate, unsafe situations. And then, still keeping human relations practical and constructive as much as possible. So really the purpose is to promote social respect, trust, and then, Islam views family units as sort of the building blocks of all society and really tries to keep those as strong as possible. Another thing that you might hear often or that a lot of these guidelines are based on is that whatever leads to a prohibited act is prohibited in and of itself. And so really what that means is that Islam takes a very preventative approach. And so as much as possible, preventing any of those kind of situations before they actually become a problem. And then another purpose of the guidelines is really to embody God consciousness. And so what that means is that we really try to, as much as possible, remind ourselves that God is watching everything we do, all of our interactions. And so, how would we act with other people knowing that and remembering that? And then the final one is a flexibility with the cultural context. And I think this is the one that's, maybe often misunderstood when people come from different cultures, because that's all they've known is how they've lived in a certain place. And so they don't necessarily know how to apply Islam in a new culture, in a new cultural context. And an example of this might be a simple thing, like if I go to the store here in the US, I make small talk or with anyone I meet, for example, the cashier, or let's just say, people we meet, we make small talk with them no matter who they are. And that's sort of part of the norm here. It's part of being polite and part of the norm. Whereas in other cultures or in other countries, that might be considered crossing a boundary, right? That might be considered, crossing a boundary and something that people would not be interested in or not want. And so that's a very simple thing, but both of those are permitted and allowed within Islam, but it's about being respectful of the culture that you're in and understanding the cultural context. Okay, so for us to really understand the guidelines, one of the things, the terms and the definitions that we really need to understand before we can get into that is something called mahram. And the mahram is basically any relation that a person is never allowed to marry. So what that means, one of the examples is close blood relative. So in English, we might just say someone who's really close to you, a close relative, a close relation, but within the legal definition of Islam, these are everyone who comes within that you could never imagine marrying is your mahram. And it's also through the ties of breastfeeding and also relatives by marriage. So for example, once I marry my spouse, I can't marry him again, so he becomes my mahram, right? And so of course, then the guidelines are there's no guidelines between a husband and wife in terms of those limitations. Same thing then also the in-laws, so parents-in-law or step-parent, stepchild, all those kinds of things now become, because generally you might be living in one household or more closely together, and so those limitations are then more relaxed. So the people for whom the limitations are more specific are those who are what we call non-mahram, not your mahram, and so anyone who you could potentially marry. And again, that's where those more specific guidelines come up. So anyone who's not within this close relative category by marriage or otherwise is where we are really focusing on those guidelines. So just, I hope I'm not going too fast. I tend to talk fast sometimes. So if anyone has questions, feel free to write it in the chat box. I can answer it right away, or we can also take questions at the end. But I just want to see if there's any questions specifically about this concept. All right. So now getting to, what are those actual guidelines? So the first thing is that the interaction between the genders has to be based on sincere and purposeful intentions. And when we say purposeful, that means that there shouldn't be any reason that's suspicious or suspect according to that particular culture, right? In that particular cultural context. And so, for example, for the purpose of work, for the purpose of school, for the purpose of really anything that's needed within society, marketplace, or you can think of all the different interactions that are needed. As long as there's that sincere intention, that's completely allowable. And then for making sure that the facial expressions and body language and tone of voice and everything is very respectful and professional is what this means. And it's interesting actually that one of the main stories where we learn these guidelines from in the Quran is the story of Moses, peace be upon him, when he had fled from Egypt and he was sort of in a place waiting, and there were two girls who were trying to get their animals to get some water, and they weren't able to. Anyways, I'm not going to go into the story in detail, but it's a very interesting story in which it goes into a lot of detail of how Moses, peace be upon him, actually interacted with the girls and helped them out in this situation. And how they responded and how they interacted. And a lot of Muslim scholars, or when we're teaching teens how to interact, we actually use that story very often. And so that's always something that if you're ever interested in looking at that. So the next one is lowering the gaze, and this is something that you might have heard or you might have actually seen or experienced. And so in the Quran it says very clearly to first tell the believing men. So tell the believing men to lower their gaze and guard their private parts, for that is purer for them. So meaning that Islam believes that the eyesight really is what also links us to situations, and so as much as possible for prevention, to not be looking at anything in a lustful way. Basically, that's the situation. And then in the same, a few verses later, it tells also the women, tell the believing women the same thing: lower their gaze and guard their private parts. So there's the same instruction for men and women, but it's first the responsibility on the men to do that. And what's interesting, sometimes I've heard this as being sort of seen as a disrespectful thing when people don't really understand, why isn't this person looking at me? They don't respect me, or because that's the cultural context here, is that when you look at someone, you make direct eye contact, that's the reason, that shows respect. Whereas in other cultures, not looking, or in the Islamic tradition, lowering the gaze, not looking at someone is actually what is considered to be respectful. And then as a side note, in some cultures, it's even taken further in terms of making direct eye contact. So I know that, when I was growing up, I have a very hard time making direct eye contact with people when I'm talking to them. I sort of have a different way to look now, so that I make sure people don't think I'm being disrespectful. But I've been told many times, that I'm being disrespectful because I'm not looking at someone in their eyes directly. But that was, again, for some cultures, maybe some of the youth that you interact with, even if they are looked at directly in their eyes by anyone, that might be a sign of being questioned or disrespected or looked down upon or made to feel uncomfortable. And so for both men, for both, for all genders. And I think that's something that that might be sort of confused sometimes, right? Because it's such a daily part of our interactions with people that, and it's such a simple thing that we don't really understand how is this person being respectful or disrespectful. And then the next one we're going to talk about is no physical touch. So I saw someone mention, no handshaking in the first assumption, and that's very correct. So again, this is another one of those preventative measures within Islam that do not even come close to an action. And so generally between those non-mahrams, right, people we are potentially allowed to marry, there's no type of physical touch. And for many Muslims, that means not shaking hands. There are some Muslims who think it's okay, within the professional context, they do shake hands. Things like hugging, side hugging, all those kinds of things might be very uncomfortable for people who have never seen that or experienced that with opposite interactions in their culture. I know for me, starting to work at a university setting, my coworkers, often patted me on the back or, different kinds of interactions. And I was very, it took me a while to get used to that or tell them, what kinds of things I was comfortable with. But things that within our culture might seem very natural or normal are things that within other cultures and also within Islam are sometimes very uncomfortable. So for example, even standing very close together in certain situations, the youth that come from other cultures may not have ever stood publicly with other people that they're not related to, right? Other genders. They might have not been in the same room alone with them ever. And so we're really understanding it from that perspective of how this is all so very new to them. And the next thing is dignified speech and actions. And this is, very basic, but just the concept of being very direct and straightforward with the way we talk with other genders when they're non-mahram, making sure that it's not excessive, making sure it's not neither side is being flirtatious or coy, but rather being very clear and not having double meanings. Really saying what you mean. There's a term in the Quran that says qawlan sadidan, which is just saying clear speech. And my husband and I often say this to each other that when we're saying, are you sure you that's what you mean, be clear, qawlan sadidan. And so just as a reminder for all of us, even within marriages, we all need that as well. And so then another one is not being in a secluded place or making sure it's always a safe place. And this is something you might have often heard in Islam, that two people who again are non-mahram should not be alone in private. So for example, in an office or in a school situation, leaving the door open, making sure it's more of a public place, or making sure that if we have to meet with people, we're having a third person with us, or it's in a public place. And this is not so much because there's suspicions or assumptions about the other person, but again, one of those preventative guideline interactions for both sides, right? I've heard many men tell me that this is something that's helped them to never be in a situation that they are accused of something, because they're always making sure that the doors are open, that it's a public place, things like that, and for women as well. And so I think that might sort of also explain for youth that why they might have never been alone in that situation. So I see that the discussion about being in a car, and I think that's something that again we have to sort of figure out within the fostering youth context. How do we sort of go about these guidelines, because it's such a different situation. Many times it's not always going to be able to maintain all of these things, but really having those conversations with the youth directly and explain, okay, so now in this cultural context in the US and in this specific scenario that you're in, what are the things that can be done in order to, what are things that can be done, what are things that maybe we can't figure out how to do? For example, they're going to be in families, in foster families that they're not related to, right? So how are we going to be managing those kinds of situations? And those are really important discussions to have, both with the families and with staff. And the final one that I'm sure everyone's sort of heard about, we often see a lot of assumptions around this, is around modest dress. So when it comes to the intergender guidelines around this, there's modest dress requirements for both men and women in Islam. And that's something that's often not known or not heard about, because we often, see or hear more about the women's modest dress requirements, but there are requirements for both men and women in terms of modesty. And unfortunately, the purpose of the hijab or the headscarf is twisted a lot of times because it's sometimes seen as done for the protection against men or things like that. And rather, it's very clear in the Quran and Islam that the purpose of the hijab for women is actually as a personal act of worship to become closer to God. And because, as I mentioned, my research was really related to this topic, I have to be really clear here that it's completely incorrect within Islam and harmful for anyone to believe that what a person wears has anything to do with the risk of sexual violence. That's absolutely not the case, and there's nowhere within Islam that is ever made to be in the same context. And so that's something that's very often twisted within society, and we need to be very clear about that. So these are the general, the general guidelines that we often talk about. How we would maybe teach our kids or our teens. What are the guidelines within Islam? And so, if there's any questions about that, please let me know. And then, if not, then I'll go on. Yeah, so Maliha gave a great answer about, maybe they would prefer to sit in the back, for example, of the car if there's a driver who is of the opposite gender. And this again might be seen initially as disrespectful, right? Because maybe the person who's driving doesn't want to be seen as a chauffeur or things like that. But again, within their religious context and within their cultural context, that might be what feels the safest to them. Great. Okay. So the next topic we're going to talk about today is gender equity in Islam. And I had prepared, this actually is its own topic, entire workshop and a presentation on its own, so I'm not going to be able to go into enough detail today. But really, once I made the workshop, and also in a previous workshop, when I asked about the assumptions, a lot of the assumptions were related to women's role in Islam and gender equity as well. And so it's really important for us to sort of address this here, because to sort of understand, and really address those misconceptions and misperceptions as well. And so many of the ones that I'm going to be talking about today seem very basic, but because there's so many incorrect understandings about Islam's view on women, we really need to sort of start from some of these very basic issues. So the first one, within Islam, as I mentioned before, there's absolutely no place for any kind of gender discrimination. And so from the very beginning, Islam says that there's equal accountability and equal reward for all genders. And what that means is that, that we all worship God in the exact same way. We have the same acts of worship, we follow the same scripture, the same beliefs, and the accountability and reward in front of God is also the same. So we're accountable for our mistakes, and we get rewarded for the things that we are doing correct. And an example of this is in Islam from the very beginning, the very first story of Adam and Eve. There's absolutely within Islam equal accountability for both Adam and Eve. And it's not more for Eve, or not blamed on Eve in any way. And we call her Hawa, peace be upon her, and Adam, peace be upon him. And in Islam, they both committed the sin, and they both repented, and they both were forgiven by God after that. And so that's sort of an example of how that situation happens. The next one, again, very basic, equal individuality and value. And what this means is that within the society, both men and women have equal value. Oftentimes in pre-Islamic and historic times, women were considered property. They weren't considered sort of their own individuality or value, whereas Islam completely made everything equal in that terms. The next is equal right to knowledge and scholarship. And the Prophet, peace be upon him, is known to have said that education is compulsory for every Muslim. And so both men and women are equally encouraged to seek knowledge. We know within Islam, actually, some of the great female Muslim scholars have been the ones who have been taking on the tradition and being able to have that scholarship. And in Islam, women and men both have equal right to, there's not a hierarchy of who can be a higher scholar than another. And in fact, the wife of the Prophet, peace be upon him, Aisha, she, more than a quarter of all of Islamic law has been transmitted through her. And so she was the one who was teaching many of the companions, and many of what we know today is through her. And so, again, after her as well, there were many female scholars as well. And so oftentimes you might hear from other cultural contexts that the difference between sending boys and girls to school, right? That's something that we often hear, that the girls aren't allowed to go to school or things like that. And it's very clear that within Islam that has no place. It has to be equal knowledge and scholarship for both. And the next is equal rights of freedom of expression. Again, a very basic one, but basically, within society, oftentimes cultural societies, people often say that, women shouldn't speak, or, don't have the right to express their questions, their doubts, or things like that. Whereas at the time of the Prophet, peace be upon him, it was very clear that women participated in public life. They went to the Prophet and questioned him, asked about these things, in open dialogue, even argued, had serious discussions, all those kinds of things with the Prophet, peace be upon him, and other Muslim leaders. And so there's no such thing as women not having the right to share their expression or share their thoughts and feelings within society equally as everyone else. And so that has to be very clear as well. And then another one is the equal right to choose a spouse. And so this is also something that you might have heard as being forced marriages or things like that. But within Islam, again, very, very clear that actually there is, the marriage cannot exist if it's forced. And the Prophet, peace be upon him, actually, a woman came to him at his time and said, my father has married me, and I was forced into it. And the Prophet, peace be upon him, asked for the father to come and said, that this marriage is completely nullified. There is no such marriage within a forced situation. And so, again, that whole cultural practice and within a cultural society of any kind of forced marriage cannot exist within Islam, the correct understanding of true Islam. And so we'll talk about, sort of, when we get to the cultural aspect, why is that the situation? Why is it that these are all the guidelines that we're talking about and all the gender equity within Islam, but why is it then in many countries and many societies around the world, we don't see these being practiced, right? The next one is the economic rights. So the equal rights to independently contract, enterprise, earn, possess, business, any kind of jobs, any kind of earnings. Both men and women have equal rights within Islam. And in fact, Islam was actually the first religious text to ensure the inheritance for women. Prior to Islam, there was no ensured inheritance for women, but within Islam, it came and set out very, strict guidelines for how both men and women inherit, and why the situation is, within that. You might often hear that Muslim women like to live by the saying that, not the saying, but the rule basically, that whatever the husband earns is for the husband and the family and the women and the wife and the children. But for women, whatever we earn through our work or through our business in any way is completely ours and cannot be touched by the man. And so there's so many of these economic rights within Islam to make sure that that they're not, neither side is taken advantage of in any way. All right, so we then come to, again, as I mentioned, this is a whole workshop in its own, so I'm trying to go through the main important ones. And really the equitable roles portion is also where there, so much, misunderstanding is there and really needs to be clarified in a much longer workshop. But the answer of equitable roles, what that means is, while men and women have equal rights and within society, as I mentioned, all of these things, and within Islam, there are specific rights and responsibilities that are not exactly identical, but we call it as equitable, so equal but different. And for example, usually that comes to when it comes to specific roles. So if it's a role as mother or father, a role as daughter or son, the role as wife or husband, those are where we're talking about. And so when it comes to, for example, and oftentimes people think that it's, the male roles have higher status. Unfortunately, that's often the perception. However, within these equitable rules, actually the majority of the sayings, the majority of the prophetic tradition and within the Quran is actually focusing on the female or women's role at a higher rank. So for example, when it comes to mothers and fathers, it's the role of the mother, and I saw this in one of the assumptions at the beginning, that the role of the mother is regarded much higher than the role of the father. And so when someone came to the Prophet, peace be upon him, and asked, who should I treat, who is most entitled to the best treatment from me, to the best companionship from me? And the Prophet, peace be upon him, replied, your mother. I said, okay, well, who's next? I said, again, your mother. Again, who's next? Your mother. So 3 times you replied, your mother. And then finally on the 4th time, I said, who next? He said, your father. And so it's a kind of often joke that we have that, our mothers are 3 times more valuable than the fathers. Of course, that's the joke. It's not true. Of course, they're both valuable, but in the sense of how much love, respect, time, effort, companionship in that terms. And then same thing within daughters. It's very interesting that so much of what we hear about going on in societies and cultures around the world is this very unfortunate, discrimination between daughters and sons. And whereas, Islam really was focusing on the emphasis and the responsibility and the treatment of daughters over sons. And prior to Islam, what used to happen is that, again, it was in a very patriarchal society, and the daughters were, again, even buried, when they were born because they wanted sons. And it's such a horrible thought. And Islam came and, completely abolished all of that. But also, not only that, it wasn't just abolishing it, but it was the Prophet, peace be upon him, has many occasions in which he says that emphasizing the ones who have daughters and raise them correctly, giving, whatever, meeting all their needs in terms of nourishment and food and school and all those kinds of things, they are the ones who will go to paradise. Many sayings about that, and focusing on daughters, whereas there aren't any specific sayings about sons in that specific regard, but rather focusing on raising many daughters, leading you to paradise, to really help people understand that time that they shouldn't prefer sons or daughters, either one. And then again, in terms of the husband and wife roles, so the Prophet, peace be upon him, said that the best person out of everyone is the one who is best to their wife. And so again, it seems like a very basic thing, but it really has to be said very clearly that both husbands and wives have different roles within the society, within the family unit, those kinds of things. But it's not, it's not the typical ones that you hear about in terms of the specific ones, but rather, actually a lot of this comes from a verse that actually talks about divorce. And so in Islam, divorce is something that is allowed, that's allowable. It's not considered a sin in any way, but rather allowed in terms of, okay, if absolutely the parties cannot get along, divorce is allowed from either the husband or the wife. And when that happens, the husband has more responsibility in terms of making sure that the wife and child are supported, similar to sort of in the modern times context of child support. And often that verse is misconstrued into something else without understanding that whole context as well. And then, one of the, I'll just sort of end on this saying for this topic, is that the wife of the Prophet was once asked, what was he like at home? What kind of husband was he? What was he like at home? And she replied, he was just like one of you, but he was the most lenient and he was the most generous. And he was always ready to give a helping hand in the ordinary work of the house. So he sewed his own clothes, he mended his own shoes. So again, these are, and he helped, in general, he helped, at home with everything. And again, these seem very basic norms and basic things to talk about, but have to be sort of clarified and talked about because of the way that they are misconstrued in our society today. Okay, so that was about gender equity. So that sort of talks about, the Islamic perspectives. But as we mentioned, as I'm sure you all have understood and realized, there's a difference between how we might hear about what's going on in different countries or in different cultural societies. And so why is that the case, right? And that's where we have to really talk about the common gender norms and what are societal norms. And this is really what a lot of my research was also about, and the difference between religious and societal norms. Societal norms are those that sort of exist if we look at throughout the world, in our own country and in many other countries around the world, they still exist, right? And that's something called hegemonic masculinity, which means basically, you might have heard the term patriarchy, or you might have heard the term, it's sort of the easy definition is when there's controlling behavior of men and practices that objectify women. Those are sort of the gendered social norms. And that's not in any specific religious context, but really the cultural and societal norms that exist everywhere. And so because of that, we have to be very clear, these societal norms are definitely not, exclusive to Muslim countries, but rather they exist everywhere. And that's really what the research shows. And so that's why there are some things that, again, might apply differently in different cultural contexts, but really when youth from other cultures come here, there has to be a really clear discussion from a religious and culturally informed perspective of how to practice their religion, how to practice their heritage in a way that's works within the society that they are in. So another one of these is the collectivist family cultures. And this is sort of what might be very different from the US culture, because here we have an individualist society, whereas where many of these youth are coming from, it's a collectivist family culture. And what that means is that the family unit is really considered the priority, right? So they're prioritized with the higher levels of family involvement, dependence, a deep sense of family commitment and obligation, responsibility. And you might see that the youth still embody a lot of those, right? They're here, but they're constantly thinking about their family at home, constantly worried about, the family unit, because that is what they consider as to be the absolute priority. And so a lot of the ideas of maintaining a family honor come from that. Okay. A lot of those concepts of maintaining the family honor, or the emphasis on that, come from ideas of collectivist family culture, and not necessarily from any kinds of religious perspectives either. And so what often happens is that when we observe a culture, when we observe a society or a country, we oftentimes conflate and sort of mix up what is the societal norms, collectivist norms, and religious norms, whereas those things really have to be separated up. So as an example, for example, the issue of girls not going to school, or the issue of forced marriages. When we take an area, for example, the Indian subcontinent, right, that includes India and Pakistan, and Afghanistan sort of on the side, but Bangladesh, many countries around that area, no matter what religion they practice, whether it's Christianity or Hinduism or Islam, they have similar, the culture is similar in terms of how they treat women in that society, right? A similar aspect that's often conflated, unfortunately, with Islam is the female genital mutilation that often happens in African countries. But again, it's a cultural thing that happens there, unfortunately, and not from a specific religious context or things like that. So I hope that sort of clarifies, where all these things are coming from. And the reason, so just to sort of show you some of the quotes from my research to help you understand this even better. So this participant, she had lived in many countries around the world, as well as grown up in the US, and she said, societies, and this is in American culture too, put an emphasis on men being simultaneously in control of things while also out of control of themselves, and then women being out of control of things but in control of themselves. And so this is really what we're talking about when we talk about societal norms, and what kinds of societal norms people are growing up in and how that influences them. And another one, I think this is one of the most really beneficial ones for our discussions today. This person said, if you don't have a balanced approach to understanding culture, then you're just getting bits and pieces, and that's where the problems come in. People could easily look at Muslim majority countries and say, oh, these people are so misogynistic. But then when they, for example, those from Muslim countries, look at the American culture, they're like, oh my gosh, why are they treating these women so badly? So it's like there are a lot of ills in society in every culture, and when we only take out these bits, you can't make a full puzzle picture out of it, so it ends up exacerbating the problem. And I think this really speaks to a lot of what we've been talking about, cultural humility from all sides, right? And in terms of really understanding how other people might be perceiving our culture as well before we consider how we're perceiving others' cultures. And this is sort of explaining how religious justifications should not be used to in any way harm other people or discriminate against other people or disrespect people, and how that can be very harmful as well. One thing we didn't do was talk about media, actually. That's something that I have mentioned in other workshops that was very beneficial, is to really, within the, when we talk about cultural and societal norms, a lot of the societal norms for our entire world, because we're such a globalized world now, come from the media, right? And if you think about how sometimes watching media, even from, the 90s or even 10 years ago, and how things have changed so much, but really how different shows or movies perceive women, how they show women or men and gender interactions and make it into a comical thing. And then if you think about perhaps many of these youth and their families, their entire understanding and perception about the West or the US comes from media. And so if that's how they're assuming gender interactions take place here, and that's what they're seeing, that sort of shows us a different perspective of, okay, maybe as we're watching it, we know this is just comedy, but maybe as they're watching it, this is what they think is how society actually takes place, right? And so we know that that's how societal norms sort of affect all around the world as well. And then, there's all these different levels, right? So I talked about the religious level, talked about the societal, cultural level, but then there's also the family level. And so many times we forget that so much of what we learn actually comes from our families, no matter what kind of culture or religious contexts we're in, and that also has to be considered. And so this participant sort of said, everything starts at the kitchen table. So if you have someone who is degrading their wife and they have children, and they're being taught how to treat one another, and if you have someone who's being affectionate, then their children generally grow up to be affectionate towards others. So of course, this is making generalizations. But really understanding that a lot of what the youth are coming here with also is from what they've just seen on a day-to-day basis with their family, especially if they haven't had a chance to go to college or go to work, and so their society is their family structure. Okay, so getting to our practical takeaways and scenario, I'd first like to share with you, a current case example that we've had brought to us from one of the agencies. And maybe we can talk through, how would we sort of approach this scenario from what we've learned today. So, the certain youth were showing more disrespectful behavior towards female staff, is what was noticed, and they seemed to be questioning the female supervisor's ability to be in charge. And they were also seeming to be more dismissive towards direct care female staff as well. And so within this sort of case example, how should we start approaching this? This might be something that you all have experienced as well, or heard about. And so I'd really like to sort of have that discussion, have that time, or if there's other scenarios that we can talk about as well, maybe you can start thinking about them, writing them, or unmuting yourself as well. But just to sort of go through, what the practical takeaways are of today's presentation, and how we might address this scenario through those practical takeaways. And the very first thing I want to say, clarify before we even talk about this, is, of course, we're not really sharing the exact findings of this specific scenario, but generally, it's really, really important to understand that never in any of the situations is any kind of violence allowed, or any kind of if someone does not feel safe with the youth in any way. But making sure that we're not excusing any type of that kind of behavior, but rather we're talking about things that can be more maybe misunderstood in terms of how people are interacting. So the first, again, practical takeaway is embodying that cultural mindset. So cultural humility mindset. So what does that mean, and what does it look like specifically within this context? But is first, coming at this with the acknowledgement that there are different cultures, have different ways of interacting between genders, and showing respect. as you mentioned, like those issues of not looking into people's eyes or not shaking hands, maybe even not smiling with different genders, or talking to them differently. And again, that all generally comes from a place of maybe discomfort. Maybe they haven't had those interactions before, or maybe that's really genuinely how they believe is the right way to respect. I know recently I was tutoring a very young boy in the mosque, and he, I'm used to with young boys before the age of puberty, sort of high-fiving them, being a little bit more relaxed, that kind of thing, as just we are with all children. And I went to give him a high five after he did a good job, and he sort of like backed away from me, looked at me really weird, was clearly uncomfortable. And rather than understanding that as being disrespectful or getting upset about that, I realized, okay, he's not comfortable. This is his, he's not comfortable with this, and I need to sort of make sure that I'm being, acting differently, and what's comfortable for him. And so within this, specific example that we shared, maybe, thinking about everything that we've talked about today, what are some of the examples are we feeling, how are we feeling towards the youth in terms of our own sort of understanding of that? And the next one is to really be responding with developmental, age-appropriate, and trauma-informed approaches. And this sort of course, comes from other workshops that have happened in the past, but I just want to emphasize again that we really need to be responding with a way that is age appropriate, right? So developmental, age appropriate, and trauma informed approaches. It's very possible that a lot of these behaviors are simply normal teen behaviors that would happen, showing disrespect, or not wanting to do things, or whatever the case may be. Really understanding that once we understand the religious context and the cultural context and the family context, then we're able to say, okay, this just is what any normal teen would act like, or in this specific situation, or any normal teen who's gone through trauma situations, how they would be acting and responding as well. And so when we take that understanding, then we can sort of say, okay, how are we going to be teaching appropriate boundaries, right, for their age and for their specific trauma experiences? How do we go about setting those appropriate boundaries, like we need to do with every teenager, or even anyone in general? How do we set those appropriate boundaries for their actions and for their behaviors as well? And then finally, recognizing the differing impacts of religion, societal culture, family norms, and systemic mistrust. So this is, again, what we've all talked about today. We didn't really cover systemic mistrust too much, but just to know that there are these differing levels and differing impacts, right? And so, one way to go about doing that is for the youth to really understand, for them to really learn what is seen as respectful or disrespectful behaviors here, right? They really need to understand and learn those in the cultural context. And so having some type of culturally informed, either youth workshops or one-on-one sessions with youth from people who are religiously and culturally informed about how to navigate those respectful gender interactions as Muslims in America. For example, shaking hands is such a big deal here when we meet people, but oftentimes if we're not comfortable with that, we put our hand on our chest and sort of be very respectful in the way we do it, rather than they might not even know how to do that, and might be seen as disrespectful in that sense. And the same thing as another one is the importance of tone and phrasing in American English. And so many times for people who are learning English as a new language or talking through interpreters, the tone and phrasing is so different between the languages. I know in Afghanistan, especially people, I'm more familiar with Pashto, but the way things are said, it might come across as being disrespectful, where that's actually just the way things are said there. That's part of the normal culture of how to communicate. And so again, through interpreting, or even if they're learning English and they're not able to say things correctly or say things in a way that's respectful, that also has to be communicated to them and taught to them in a respectful way. And then also helping them understand, the types of roles that women here in the US have, right? So if they're saying that they don't seem to be respecting female supervisors, it needs to be made very clear to them about, what does it mean, how does the US society work in terms of who has, who has the ability to make certain decisions. It's all about, for example, someone's title in the hierarchy in the company and all that kind of stuff. It doesn't have anything to do with gender. So all those kinds of things really have to be made clear to the youth as well. And another thing that in the past I've worked on is healthy masculinity workshops. And this is, a common type of beneficial workshop for teens from any culture and any country in the US as well, but really understanding what healthy masculinity looks like within their religion, within their cultural values. And it's often very beneficial when it comes from a Muslim scholar, as they use examples from the Quran, and as I did today, for example. And so helping the youth understand that and getting a workshop around that as well. Of course, workshops are not the answer to everything, but just, having those really important discussions and continuing to have them on a regular basis is very important as well. So I didn't leave much time, but I hope maybe if you can all stay a few minutes longer and just, if there's any questions you all have, and really any scenarios that you'd like to sort of share about what things have come up for you, or, what things we can sort of work through together and address together today. I'd love to sort of open it up for that discussion right now. Or any other questions you all have from this work.